A man's honor is measured not by what he does when everyone is watching, but by what he does when no one can stop him. In the scorching Colombian sun of 1987, Detective Carlos Mendoza had seen enough blood to fill the Magdalena River, but nothing prepared him for what he witnessed in Medellin's Central Market that Tuesday morning. Through the lens of his surveillance camera, he watched a mountain of muscle called El Martillo corner Maria Victoria Henao near the fruit vendors, his meaty hands grabbing at her while tourists and locals scattered like startled birds. Pablo Escobar's wife, elegant, untouchable, protected by an invisible army, stood frozen as this rival enforcer whispered threats that made her face drain of color. Carlos knew he should intervene, but his cover was everything. His secret government task force had spent 2 years infiltrating Escobar's world, documenting every move, every betrayal, every drop of spilled blood. One blown surveillance operation could destroy it all. 3 days later, El Martillo's body appeared in that same market square, positioned on his knees in perfect apology, but the security footage showed something that haunts Carlos still. Could Pablo's reach extend beyond the physical realm, tapping into something far darker than any cartel power? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Carlos had watched the surveillance footage 17 times, frame by frame, until his eyes burned and his hands trembled from too much coffee. Each viewing revealed the same impossible sequence: El Martillo walking purposefully through the market at 6:47 a.m., his massive frame moving with the mechanical precision of a man sleepwalking. No one guided him, no one forced him. He simply walked to the exact spot where he had cornered Maria Victoria 3 days earlier, dropped to his knees, and died. The coroner's report made even less sense. Jorge Ramirez, El Martillo, had died of what appeared to be complete organ failure, his heart, liver, and kidneys shutting down simultaneously at 6:52 a.m. No poison in his system, no signs of trauma. Just death, arriving like an appointment he couldn't miss. Carlos leaned back in the cramped surveillance van that had become his second home over the past 2 years. The van reeked of stale cigarettes and the cheap cologne he wore to blend in with the locals. Through the one-way windows, he could see the market square where vendors were setting up their stalls, carefully avoiding the spot where El Martillo had knelt. Someone had scrubbed the blood away, but the concrete still bore a faint stain that looked disturbingly like a man's shadow. His radio crackled. "Mendoza, you getting this?" The voice belonged to Agent Patricia Vasquez, his handler from Bogotá. She called him twice weekly, demanding updates that Carlos increasingly struggled to provide. Getting what? Carlos adjusted his earpiece, never taking his eyes off the market. "Intercept from our sources inside the Cali cartel. They're calling it El Castigo del Alma, punishment of the soul. Word is spreading that Escobar has found a way to kill without touching, to punish without being present. Half the sicarios in Medellin are wearing crucifixes and visiting their mothers." Carlos felt ice form in his stomach. In his 45 years, 20 of them in law enforcement, he had seen men killed with machetes, dissolved in acid, fed to dogs. But this was different. This was terror that reached into places bullets couldn't touch. "Patricia, I need to know what our intelligence says about Maria Victoria's whereabouts that morning." A pause. "Why?" "Because 3 days ago, I watched El Martillo humiliate her in public. Yesterday morning, he walked to that exact spot and died on his knees. If there's a connection..." "There's no connection, Carlos. Men die every day in Medellin. Your job isn't to solve murders, it's to document Escobar's organization. Don't lose sight of that." The line went dead, but Carlos kept the earpiece in, listening to static that sounded like whispered prayers. Patricia was wrong about his job. He wasn't just documenting Pablo's empire, he was living inside it, breathing its air, watching its rules reshape reality itself. His cover identity as a freelance photographer gave him access to places most law enforcement couldn't reach. He sold pictures to newspapers, documented weddings and quinceañeras, and slowly, carefully, built a catalog of faces, names, and connections within Pablo's network. The Medellin cartel trusted him because he had something they desperately needed: the ability to make them look human in photographs, to capture moments of joy and family that balanced the scales against their darkness. But trust was a dangerous currency in Pablo's world. Carlos had learned to sleep with his camera beside his bed, to develop film in bathroom darkrooms, to hide memory cards inside hollowed-out religious candles. Every photograph he took for the government was a betrayal that could end with his body feeding the fishes in Guatape. The morning sun climbed higher, and Carlos noticed something that made his blood run cold. Maria Victoria Henao was walking through the market, her bodyguards maintaining a respectful distance as she moved between the fruit vendors. She wore a simple white dress that caught the light like blessed fabric, and her face held an expression of serene calm that seemed impossible for someone who had been terrorized just days before. She stopped exactly where El Martillo had died. Carlos raised his telephoto lens, his finger hovering over the shutter button. Through the viewfinder, he watched Maria Victoria kneel and place a single white flower on the stained concrete. Her lips moved in what might have been prayer or might have been something else entirely. When she stood and turned toward his van, Carlos felt his breath catch. For one impossible moment, her eyes seemed to find his lens across the crowded square, and her smile was both beautiful and terrible. Then she was gone, disappearing into the crowd like smoke, leaving only the white flower and questions that Carlos knew would follow him into sleepless nights. He lowered his camera and realized his hands were shaking. In Pablo Escobar's Medellin, the line between justice and vengeance had always been thin, but Carlos was beginning to suspect that some lines, once crossed, led to territories that existed beyond any map he knew how to read. Carlos forced his trembling hands to steady as he drove the surveillance van through Medellin's congested streets. Maria Victoria's haunting smile burned into his retinas like an afterimage of lightning. The white flower she had left behind felt like an accusation, though of what he couldn't say. He needed normalcy, needed to return to the careful routines that had kept him alive for 2 years in Pablo's shadow. His apartment sat in a middle-class neighborhood that straddled the line between respectability and desperation, where government employees lived alongside cartel accountants, and everyone pretended not to notice their neighbors' late-night visitors. Carlos had chosen the location carefully. It was unremarkable enough to avoid attention, but stable enough to suggest he was exactly what he claimed to be, a photographer making an honest living in a dishonest city. The building's security guard, Miguel, waved from his post beside the entrance. "Hola, Carlos, you're back early today." "Light morning," Carlos lied, forcing casualness into his voice. Miguel had worked this job for 6 years, which meant he either saw nothing or saw everything and knew when to stay silent. In Medellin, both skills were equally valuable. Carlos climbed 3 flights of stairs to apartment 3B, his camera bag heavy against his shoulder. The hallway smelled of fried plantains and cheap disinfectant, comforting in its ordinariness. He unlocked 3 deadbolts, standard practice in a city where home invasions were as common as power outages, and stepped into the space that served as both his sanctuary and his prison. The apartment was small but meticulously organized. His legitimate photography equipment occupied the front room, professional lighting, backdrop stands, and portfolios of wedding and family portraits that established his cover. Hidden behind a false panel in the bedroom closet, however, lay his real work: telephoto lenses capable of capturing faces from 6 blocks away, listening devices disguised as tourist trinkets, and memory cards containing enough evidence to destroy half the cartel if they ever reached Bogotá. Carlos set his camera bag on the kitchen table and immediately went to check the small pieces of tape he placed on windows and door frames each morning, all intact. No one had entered while he was gone, but the paranoia never faded. In this business, the moment you stopped checking was the moment you died. His landline was blinking with messages. Carlos played them while preparing his usual lunch of arepa and black coffee, simple food that reminded him of his childhood in Cali before the world had grown complicated. "Carlos, it's Elena." His ex-wife's voice carried the familiar mixture of affection and exasperation that had defined their marriage. "Sophia has a recital next Thursday at 7. She specifically asked if you could come. I know you're busy with work, but she's only 12 once." The message continued, but Carlos found himself staring at the framed photograph on his refrigerator. Sophia in her school uniform, gap-toothed grin bright as sunlight. His daughter lived in Bogotá with Elena, safely distant from Medellin's violence but equally distant from him. The job that kept her safe also kept her a stranger. Thursday. Carlos mentally calculated his surveillance schedule, the careful timing of market observations and cartel social events that comprised his world. Patricia would expect a full report on Pablo's movements that week, but Sofia only had one recital. The second message was from Father Martinez at Santa Maria Church. "Carlos, we still need photographs for the confirmation ceremony this weekend. The families are counting on you." Carlos had been the unofficial church photographer for 18 months, a role that provided perfect cover while documenting which cartel families attended which services. But it had also become something more, a connection to the community he was secretly betraying. These weren't just targets in his viewfinder anymore, they were people who trusted him to capture their children's most sacred moments. He thought about Mrs. Gutierrez, whose son would be confirmed on Saturday. She worked 3 jobs to keep her family fed while her husband served time for cartel-related charges. When Carlos photographed her boy receiving communion, would he be documenting a beautiful moment or gathering intelligence on a future sicario? The third message made his coffee cup freeze halfway to his lips. "Mr. Mendoza, this is Carmen from Pablo's office." The woman's voice was professionally neutral, giving no hint of emotion. "Mr. Escobar would like to meet with you this afternoon to discuss a photography project. Please come to the Nápoles Ranch at 4 o'clock. A car will pick you up at 3:30. Carlos stared at the answering machine as if it might offer additional explanation. In 2 years of careful work, he had never been summoned directly by Pablo. Their contact had always been through intermediaries, wedding coordinators who happened to work for the cartel, newspaper editors who occasionally published his photographs alongside carefully planted stories. A direct invitation to Nápoles meant one of 2 things. Pablo had a special job for him, or Pablo had discovered what he really was. Carlos looked again at Sofia's photograph, then at the hidden panel containing evidence that could bring down an empire. The white flower Maria Victoria had placed that morning suddenly seemed less like a memorial and more like a warning. In 3 hours, he would learn which interpretation was correct. Carlos sat motionless at his kitchen table, the answering machine's red light blinking like a heartbeat counting down his remaining time. The coffee had grown cold in his cup, but he couldn't bring himself to move. Every instinct honed by 20 years in law enforcement screamed that this summons was different, that the careful balance he'd maintained for 2 years was about to collapse. He forced himself to think through the possibilities methodically. Pablo's invitation could be legitimate. Perhaps the cartel leader truly needed documentation for some family event or propaganda purpose. Carlos had photographed dozens of such occasions through intermediaries, creating images that humanized monsters for newspaper consumption. His reputation for discretion and artistic skill had grown within Pablo's circles, but the timing felt too coincidental. 3 days after El Martillo's public harassment of Maria Victoria, hours after that white flower appeared on blood-stained concrete, minutes after Carlos had captured Maria Victoria's unnervingly direct gaze through his telephoto lens. He replayed that moment in the market square, frame by frame like the surveillance footage he'd studied obsessively. Had she really looked directly at his hidden position, or was paranoia making him see patterns where none existed? In this business, the line between intuition and delusion was razor thin. Carlos walked to his bedroom and opened the hidden panel behind his clothes. The evidence inside represented 2 years of painstaking work, photographs of cartel meetings, recordings of conversations, financial documents photographed during wedding receptions when guards were distracted by celebration. Enough material to cripple Pablo's organization and save countless lives. Enough to get Carlos killed slowly if discovered. He pulled out a small device that looked like a tourist's pocket camera but contained a transmitter capable of sending an emergency signal to Patricia in Bogotá. Standard protocol dictated that he activate it before any high-risk encounter. But using it now would mean admitting his cover was blown, ending the operation that had consumed his life. His hands trembled as he weighed the device. Once he pressed the emergency button, extraction teams would mobilize. He would disappear from Medellín forever, become another ghost in the government's witness protection program. He would never again photograph weddings where cartel wives wept with genuine joy. Never document children's confirmations in churches where sicarios prayed beside their victims' mothers. Never see his daughter's recital next Thursday. But staying meant walking into Napoles Ranch with Pablo Escobar, a man who had turned murder into performance art. Carlos had documented enough cartel executions to know that death in Pablo's world was rarely quick or merciful. If his cover was blown, he would die in ways that would make El Martillo's mysterious demise seem like a blessing. The clock on his nightstand read 2:15, 45 minutes until the car arrived. Carlos returned to the kitchen and picked up Sophia's photograph. His daughter's smile seemed to mock his indecision. What kind of father chose his mission over his life? What kind of man prioritized catching monsters over watching his child grow up? But then he thought of Mrs. Gutierrez, working 3 jobs while her husband rotted in prison for cartel crimes. Of the vendors in the market square who still avoided the blood-stained spot where El Martillo died. Of the countless families destroyed by Pablo's empire, while government officials counted bribes and looked away. Carlos had seen too much to walk away now. The evidence hidden in his bedroom could save lives, but only if he stayed alive long enough to deliver it. And that meant maintaining his cover, even if it required walking into Pablo's lair with a smile and a camera. He made his decision with the cold calculation that had kept him breathing in this nightmare city. The emergency transmitter went back into its hiding place. Instead, Carlos selected his best camera equipment and a small recording device disguised as a light meter. If Pablo wanted a photographer, he would get one, but every moment would be documented for later analysis. Carlos showered and dressed carefully in clothes that suggested success without ostentation. Pressed khakis, a crisp white shirt, leather shoes polished to military standards. He looked like what he claimed to be, a professional photographer grateful for prestigious work. At 3:20, he positioned himself by the window overlooking the street. A black Mercedes arrived precisely on schedule, its windows tinted dark enough to hide passengers or weapons. 2 men in white shirts sat in the front seat, their postures suggesting concealed firearms. Carlos grabbed his camera bag and locked his apartment, checking each deadbolt twice out of habit that might soon become meaningless. In the hallway, Miguel looked up from his newspaper with curious eyes. "Big job today?" the security guard asked. "Could be," Carlos replied, managing what he hoped was a confident smile. "Could change everything." As he walked toward the Mercedes, Carlos felt the weight of 2 years' worth of secrets pressing against his shoulders. In 20 minutes he would sit across from the most dangerous man in Colombia, pretending to be someone he wasn't, while gathering intelligence that could destroy an empire. The car door opened, and Carlos stepped through it into whatever came next. The Mercedes interior smelled of leather and expensive cologne, but beneath it lurked something else, the metallic scent of fear that no amount of luxury could mask. Carlos settled into the plush seat, his camera bag positioned carefully on his lap like a shield, and tried to project the eager professionalism expected of a photographer about to meet Colombia's most notorious celebrity. The driver met his eyes in the rearview mirror. "Phone," the man said simply, extending a calloused hand. Carlos's stomach dropped. He had anticipated this. Pablo's security was legendary for its thoroughness, but surrendering his encrypted phone felt like cutting his last lifeline to the civilized world. He handed over the device, watching it disappear into the driver's jacket pocket along with any chance of calling for help. The passenger beside the driver turned halfway around, revealing a face Carlos recognized from surveillance photographs: Jorge el Arquitecto Morales, Pablo's chief of security. A man who had earned his nickname not through construction work, but through his methodical approach to dismantling enemies piece by piece. "Welcome, Carlos," El Arquitecto said with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Pablo is very excited to meet you. He's heard wonderful things about your work." The words should have been reassuring, but El Arquitecto's tone carried undertones that made Carlos's military training scream warnings. This wasn't how you spoke to a valued contractor. This was how you comforted a condemned man. As the Mercedes navigated Medellin's winding streets toward the countryside, Carlos found himself cataloging everything: license plates, route markers, the subtle bulges in his escort's clothing that suggested multiple weapons. 2 years of covert work had trained him to document automatically, but now each observation felt like evidence for a case that might never see trial. His thoughts drifted to Sophia's recital next Thursday. Elena had mentioned that their daughter specifically asked for him to attend. which meant Sofia still believed her father was a simple photographer who traveled for work. The innocence in that assumption felt heavier than any burden he had carried in his adult life. What would happen to Sofia if he never returned from Nápoles? Elena would tell her that Daddy had an accident, probably, keeping the truth buried until their daughter was old enough to understand that the world contained men who killed for sport. But Carlos knew the statistics. Children of missing government operatives carried scars that never healed, spent their lives wondering if their fathers had been heroes or cowards in the end. The Mercedes began climbing into the hills outside Medellin, where Pablo's ranch sprawled across thousands of acres like a feudal kingdom. Carlos had studied satellite photos of the compound, but seeing it through the windshield made his mouth go dry. Guard towers punctuated the perimeter every 100 meters, and armed men moved with the casual alertness of soldiers in a war zone. Impressive, no? El Arquitecto commented, following Carlos's gaze. Pablo believes in being prepared for unexpected visitors. The comment felt loaded with meaning. How many visitors had traveled this same route and never returned? How many photographers, journalists, and government officials had admired these same guard towers before disappearing into mass graves? Carlos forced his hands to remain steady on his camera bag. Inside the leather case, his concealed recording device was already active, capturing every word and sound for later analysis, assuming there would be a later. The device looked identical to a standard light meter, a piece of equipment any professional photographer would carry, but it represented his only chance of documenting whatever Pablo really wanted. The car passed through 3 separate checkpoints, each more heavily fortified than the last. At the final gate, guards with assault rifles conducted a thorough inspection of the vehicle while others radioed ahead to announce their arrival. Carlos noticed that the guards' uniforms bore no insignia, but their equipment was military grade and their discipline suggested formal training. These weren't street thugs with pistols, they were soldiers in Pablo's private army. As they drove through the ranch's interior, Carlos glimpsed incongruities that spoke to Pablo's complex personality. Exotic animals grazing near helicopter landing pads, classical sculptures positioned between machine gun nests, gardens maintained with museum-quality care just meters from interrogation facilities. Beauty and brutality coexisted here with the same casual intimacy Carlos had witnessed throughout Medellin. His photographer's eye automatically framed shots he would never be allowed to take. The way afternoon light caught razor wire, the elegant architecture of buildings designed to contain screams. 2 years of documenting cartel life had taught him to see aesthetics even in horror, but Nápoles felt different. This wasn't just Pablo's home, it was his kingdom, where the laws of Colombia held no more weight than tourist suggestions. The Mercedes finally stopped before a sprawling hacienda that could have graced any architectural magazine, if not for the armed guards flanking its entrance. El Arquitecto turned completely around in his seat, studying Carlos with the intensity of a pathologist examining specimens. "Before we go inside," he said quietly, "Pablo wants you to know that he values honesty above all other virtues. Men who lie to him tend to discover creative new definitions of regret." Carlos met the security chief's stare with what he hoped passed for confused innocence. "Of course. I'm just here to take photographs." El Arquitecto's smile widened, and Carlos realized he might have just signed his own death warrant. The car door opened with a soft click that sounded like a coffin closing. Carlos stepped onto the circular driveway, his leather shoes crunching against imported gravel that probably cost more than most Medellin families earned in a year. The afternoon heat pressed against him like a living thing, but the chill in his spine had nothing to do with temperature. El Arquitecto gestured toward the hacienda's entrance with the practiced courtesy of a funeral director. "After you, Carlos." No choice now. Carlos gripped his camera bag tighter and walked toward the massive wooden doors, carved with religious imagery that seemed obscene in this context. Angels and saints gazed down at him with eyes that had witnessed too much, their stone faces offering neither comfort nor condemnation. The guards at the entrance conducted a professional search, their hands moving efficiently through his camera equipment. Carlos forced himself to breathe normally as they examined each lens, each filter, each seemingly innocent piece of gear. The disguised recording device passed inspection without comment, just another light meter to these men who understood weapons better than photography. Inside, the hacienda's grandeur struck him like a physical blow. Marble floors gleamed beneath crystal chandeliers that belonged in European palaces. Original paintings, Carlos recognized at least one Botero worth millions. Lined walls that had probably echoed with screams just hours earlier. The contradiction wasn't accidental, it was Pablo's signature, his way of demonstrating that beauty and terror were simply different tools for achieving the same end. Impressive collection, Carlos managed, his voice steadier than he had any right to expect. Pablo appreciates fine things, El Arquitecto replied, leading him deeper into the house. He believes that a man's surroundings should reflect his achievements. They passed through a series of rooms that felt more like museum galleries than living spaces. Each showcased Pablo's evolution from street criminal to cultural icon, photographs with politicians, awards from grateful communities, even a framed letter from the Pope thanking him for charitable donations. Carlos's trained eye caught the subtle security measures, cameras disguised as decorative elements, pressure plates beneath antique rugs, guards positioned at strategic intervals throughout the house. In the final hallway, El Arquitecto stopped before an ornate door and turned to face Carlos directly. "One last thing," he said, his tone carrying the weight of final instructions. "Pablo has been watching your work for some time, longer than you might think." The words hit Carlos like ice water. How long had Pablo been aware of him? Since the first wedding he'd photographed? Since his arrival in Medellin? Or had his cover been blown from the very beginning, turning 2 years of dangerous work into an elaborate game whose rules only Pablo understood? El Arquitecto knocked twice, paused, then knocked once more. A voice from inside, unmistakably Pablo's, though Carlos had only heard it on surveillance recordings, called out a greeting that sounded genuinely warm. The door swung open, revealing an office that seemed designed to intimidate through understated elegance rather than obvious threat. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of the ranch, where exotic animals grazed peacefully beside landing strips and weapons bunkers. Behind an antique desk that had probably belonged to Spanish colonial governors sat Pablo Escobar himself, looking exactly like the photographs, but somehow more substantial, more present, as if reality had been waiting for his permission to solidify around him. "Carlos!" Pablo rose with the enthusiasm of a man greeting an old friend, his arms spread wide in welcome. "Finally, we meet in person. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a very long time." The warmth in Pablo's voice was genuine, which made it infinitely more terrifying than any threat could have been. Carlos stepped into the office, feeling the door close behind him with the finality of a trap springing shut. Every survival instinct screamed at him to run, but there was nowhere to go, no backup coming, no escape route, just him, his cover story, and a man who had turned murder into mythology. "Thank you for inviting me, Mr. Escobar," Carlos said, amazed that his voice remained professional. "I'm honored to be here." Pablo's eyes, intelligent, curious, completely without mercy, studied Carlos with the intensity of a scientist examining a fascinating specimen. "Please, call me Pablo. We're going to know each other very well, I think." Carlos set his camera bag on the floor with deliberate care, buying time to process the implications of that statement. Whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine whether he lived to see Sophia's recital, whether 2 years of intelligence gathering had any meaning, whether justice could survive in a world where men like Pablo created their own reality through sheer force of will. Pablo gestured to a chair positioned directly across from his desk. "Sit," he said, his tone still friendly but carrying an undertone that made refusal impossible. "Let's discuss this photography project. I think you'll find it unlike anything you've done before." Carlos sat down, crossing a threshold he could never uncross, and prepared to discover what Pablo Escobar really wanted from a man he might already know was a spy. Pablo settled back into his leather chair with the relaxed confidence of a man who had never encountered a problem he couldn't solve through money or violence. Behind him, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the ranch, where Carlos could see workers moving between buildings with the purposeful efficiency of people who understood that mistakes here carried permanent consequences. "Tell me about Maria Victoria," Pablo said without preamble, his voice carrying the same casual tone he might use to discuss the weather. The words hit Carlos like a physical blow, All pretense of this being about photography evaporated in an instant. Pablo knew, had always known. The entire charade, the Mercedes ride, the security theater, the polite introductions, had been an elaborate test, and Carlos had failed before the first question. "I'm not sure I understand," Carlos replied carefully, though his mouth had gone dry as desert sand. Pablo's smile never wavered, but something shifted in his eyes, a flicker of amusement that suggested he was enjoying this immensely. "Of course you do. You were there 3 days ago, in the market, camera in hand, documenting everything like the professional you claim to be." He paused, letting the words settle. "What did you think of El Martillo's performance?" Carlos felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the office's air conditioning. Every instinct screamed at him to maintain his cover, but Pablo's tone suggested that pretending ignorance would only accelerate whatever was coming. "It was disturbing," he said finally. "Disturbing," Pablo repeated, as if tasting the word. "Yes, I imagine it was. A man laying hands on another man's wife, threatening her children, believing himself untouchable because her husband wasn't present to defend her honor." His voice hardened with each word. "What would you do in such a situation, Carlos?" The question felt like standing on the edge of a cliff in the dark, unable to see how far the drop extended. Carlos had witnessed enough interrogations to recognize the technique. Pablo wasn't seeking information he didn't already possess. He was testing Carlos's character, his loyalties, his willingness to play by rules that existed only in Pablo's mind. "I would want justice," Carlos answered truthfully. "Justice." Pablo stood and moved to the window, his hands clasped behind his back as he gazed out at his kingdom. "An interesting concept. Tell me, in your work as a photographer," he emphasized the word slightly, "have you observed much justice in Medellin?" Carlos felt the weight of every case file hidden in his apartment, every photograph documenting atrocities that would never see prosecution. "Not enough," he admitted. "Precisely." Pablo turned back toward him, and Carlos caught a glimpse of something deeper than mere criminality, a conviction that was somehow more terrifying than simple greed or cruelty. The government promises justice but delivers only corruption. The police speak of law while taking bribes. The rich preach morality while exploiting the poor, but here, he gestured toward the window, justice is immediate and absolute. A soft knock interrupted the conversation. El Arquitecto entered without waiting for permission, carrying a manila folder that he placed on Pablo's desk. Carlos caught a glimpse of photographs spilling from the envelope, surveillance shots taken with telephoto lenses, images that showed him entering police stations, meeting with government officials, performing all the activities that had supposedly been conducted under perfect operational security. "Ah," Pablo said, settling back into his chair with renewed interest. "Now we can discuss your real work, Detective Mendoza." The use of his actual name and rank struck Carlos like a hammer blow. 2 years of careful cover building, of becoming Carlos the photographer, crumbled in an instant. But strangely, with the pretense gone, he felt a twisted sense of relief. No more lies, no more elaborate performances. Just 2 men who understood exactly where they stood. "How long have you known?" Carlos asked. "Since your 2nd week in Medellin," Pablo replied casually. "Did you really think you could infiltrate my city without my knowledge? Every government operative who sets foot here becomes my guest, whether they realize it or not." Carlos's mind raced through the implications. If Pablo had known from the beginning, why allow the charade to continue? Why not simply eliminate the threat? Unless— "You wanted me to gather intelligence," Carlos said slowly, pieces clicking into place. "You've been feeding me information deliberately." Pablo's laugh was genuinely delighted. "Very good. Yes, detective, every photograph you've taken, every report you've filed, every piece of evidence you've collected, all carefully curated to show my enemies exactly what I wanted them to see. You've been working for me all along." The revelation hit Carlos harder than any physical blow. 2 years of his life, countless risks, endless nights away from Sofia, all of it orchestrated by the man he'd been hunting. He had become Pablo's unwitting agent, a puppet dancing to strings he'd never even seen. "But now," Pablo continued, his tone shifting to something more serious, "I have a different task for you. Something that will test whether you're truly committed to justice or merely following orders. Carlos stared across the desk at Colombia's most wanted criminal and realized his real education was just beginning. Pablo opened the manila folder with deliberate ceremony, spreading the surveillance photographs across his desk like tarot cards revealing an unwelcome future. Carlos recognized himself in each image, entering the DA's building, meeting his handler at the cathedral, photographing crime scenes that had never been released to any journalist. The documentation was thorough, professional, and damning. 2 years, Pablo mused, arranging the photos in chronological order. 2 years of watching you work, detective. Do you know what impressed me most? Not your dedication, that's common among government dogs. Not your courage, though I admit you have more than most. What fascinated me was your capacity for genuine outrage. Carlos remained silent, studying Pablo's face for any hint of what was coming. The man across from him bore no resemblance to the caricature painted by government briefings. No wild-eyed fanatic or savage criminal. Just intelligent eyes and a face that seemed almost ordinary, if not for the absolute certainty it projected. The expression of someone who had never encountered a force he couldn't ultimately overcome. El Martillo, Pablo continued, selecting a photograph that showed Carlos documenting the market scene 3 days earlier. You watched him humiliate my wife, threaten my children, and something inside you broke. I saw it in your face, detective. For that moment you forgot about your mission, your cover, your precious government orders. You just wanted someone to stop him. The observation cut deeper than any interrogation technique because it was absolutely true. Carlos had watched Maria Victoria's fear and felt something primal override his training, a rage that transcended professional duty. What happened to him? Carlos asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. Pablo's smile carried no warmth. Justice happened, swift, absolute, and perfectly appropriate to his crime. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to conversational tones that somehow made his words more chilling. Would you like to see? Before Carlos could respond, El Arquitecto wheeled in a television and video player. The security chief worked with practiced efficiency, clearly familiar with this routine. How many times had Pablo used audiovisual aids to make his points? How many government operatives had sat in this same chair, watching demonstrations of power that redefined their understanding of possibility? The screen flickered to life, showing grainy footage from multiple security cameras. Timestamps indicated the recording had been made just hours after the market incident. Carlos watched El Martillo walking through what appeared to be a warehouse district, his movements casual and unhurried. Nothing suggested the man felt any particular concern about his earlier behavior. Keep watching, Pablo instructed. The footage cut between different angles as El Martillo continued his evening routine, stopping for food, making phone calls, conducting what looked like routine cartel business. Then, abruptly, his behavior changed. He stopped mid-conversation with an associate, his face contorting as if hearing something terrible. But the audio revealed nothing unusual, just street noise and distant music. El Martillo began walking with sudden purpose, his previous casualness replaced by mechanical precision. He moved through the streets of Medellin like a man following invisible instructions, never hesitating at intersections, never pausing to consider his route. Other cartel members called out to him, but he showed no awareness of their presence. Where is he going? Carlos found himself asking. To apologize, Pablo replied simply. The footage followed El Martillo to the same market square where he had accosted Maria Victoria. Dawn was breaking, vendors beginning to set up their stalls for another day. Without pause or explanation, El Martillo walked to the exact spot where the confrontation had occurred, dropped to his knees, and began speaking to empty air, his lips moving in what appeared to be desperate pleas for forgiveness. Then he died. No visible cause, no weapon, no struggle. One moment he was kneeling in apparent anguish, the next he was simply gone, his body maintaining its posture as if death were just another form of penance. Carlos stared at the frozen image on screen, his mind struggling to process what he had witnessed. How? Wrong question, Pablo said, switching off the television. The question isn't how, detective. It's why you're here watching this instead of filing another useless report with your handlers in Bogotá. The weight of Pablo's attention felt crushing. Every word carried implications that Carlos couldn't quite grasp, suggestions of choices he hadn't realized he was making. 2 years of infiltration work had prepared him for violence, torture, even death, but not for this. Not for having his entire worldview systematically dismantled by a man who seemed to operate according to laws that transcended conventional understanding. "You're going to help me with something," Pablo continued, his tone suggesting the matter was already decided. "A task that will require you to choose between the justice your government promises and the justice I deliver." Carlos felt the walls closing in, not just around the room but around his entire life. Sophia's recital, Elena's trust, the mission that had consumed 2 years of careful work, everything balanced on the edge of whatever Pablo was about to propose. "What kind of task?" he asked. Pablo's smile returned, and Carlos realized he had just crossed another line he couldn't uncross. Pablo reached into his desk drawer with deliberate slowness, withdrawing a thick manila envelope that he placed between them like a gauntlet thrown down. The paper was expensive, cream-colored, and sealed with red wax bearing an impression Carlos didn't recognize, some kind of ancient symbol that seemed to writhe in the shifting light from the windows. "Inside this envelope," Pablo said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute finality, "are photographs. Not surveillance shots like these," he gestured dismissively at the scattered images of Carlos's covert activities, "but something far more intimate. Your daughter Sophia's school, your wife Elena's clinic, the route you take to your safe house each evening, the cafe where you meet your handler, every detail of the life you've built while pretending to be someone else." Carlos felt his blood turn to ice. The room seemed to telescope around him, Pablo's words echoing as if spoken from the bottom of a well. Everything he had feared, every nightmare scenario he had trained himself not to imagine, was materializing with the casual efficiency Pablo brought to all his endeavors. "You're threatening my family." "I'm offering you clarity," Pablo corrected, his tone remaining conversational. "For 2 years, you've lived between worlds. Detective Mendoza by night, Carlos the photographer by day, loyal husband when convenient, government operative when necessary. But this," he tapped the envelope, "requires you to choose. One world, one loyalty, one version of justice." The envelope sat between them like a loaded weapon, its wax seal catching the afternoon light. Carlos understood that opening it would represent another threshold crossed, another step away from any possibility of return to his former life. But refusing to open it wouldn't make its contents less real. "What's the task?" Carlos asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Pablo leaned back in his chair, studying Carlos with the intensity of a chess master contemplating a crucial move. 3 days from now, your handlers are planning a raid on one of my processing facilities. Your intelligence made it possible. Photographs of entry points, security protocols, shift changes, all meticulously documented by my most trusted spy." The words hit Carlos like physical blows. His surveillance work, every carefully captured image, had been orchestrated to provide Pablo's enemies with exactly the information they needed to walk into a trap. But if Pablo already knew about the raid, why was he revealing this? Why not simply let it happen? "Because," Pablo continued, as if reading his thoughts, "this raid will be different. The facility they're planning to hit isn't a cocaine lab. It's a children's hospital, my children's hospital, built with my money, staffed with my doctors, treating poor children whose parents can't afford medical care anywhere else. Your government friends are going to arrive expecting to find drug operations, and instead they'll slaughter innocent children in their beds." Carlos felt the world tilting beneath him. The carefully constructed moral framework that had sustained him through 2 years of undercover work began crumbling like a structure built on sand. Pablo wasn't just revealing government incompetence or corruption. He was demonstrating how Carlos himself had been weaponized against everything he claimed to protect. "You're lying." "Am I?" Pablo opened a second folder, revealing architectural plans, medical licenses, and photographs of children receiving treatment. "Dr. Elena Vasquez has volunteered there twice, Detective. Did she mention treating patients at a facility funded by Pablo Escobar, or did she simply see it as helping children in need?" The name of Elena's volunteer work, the clinic she'd mentioned visiting, the sick children who had moved her to tears when describing their conditions, crashed into Carlos's consciousness with devastating clarity. His wife had been working at Pablo's hospital. His intelligence would guide government forces to attack the place where Elena spent her free time saving lives. Pablo stood and moved to the window again, his silhouette dark against the Colombian afternoon. "So here's your choice, detective. In 72 hours, you can file your scheduled report recommending the raid proceed as planned. Your handlers will be pleased with your thoroughness. Your family will remain safe in their ignorance. And 37 children will die in their beds while government forces search for cocaine laboratories that don't exist." Carlos gripped the arms of his chair, feeling as if the floor might collapse beneath him. Every option led through nightmare territory. Betraying his mission meant treason. Following orders meant becoming complicit in massacre. There was no clean choice, no path that preserved both duty and conscience. "Or," Pablo continued, turning back toward him with eyes that held no mercy and infinite patience, "you can help me save those children. And in doing so, discover what justice actually looks like when it's not filtered through government bureaucracy and political convenience." Pablo returned to his desk and placed his hand on the sealed envelope. "But understand this, Detective Mendoza. Whatever you choose in this room today will echo through the rest of your life. There will be no pretending you didn't know, no claiming you were just following orders. This is the moment when you decide what kind of man you really are." Carlos stared at the envelope and realized his ordeal had only just begun. Carlos reached for the envelope with trembling fingers, the wax seal feeling warm against his skin as if it had absorbed heat from some internal fire. The ancient symbol pressed into the red wax seemed to pulse with malevolent life, and for a moment he hesitated, understanding instinctively that some knowledge, once gained, could never be unknown. The seal cracked with a sound like breaking bones. Inside were photographs, just as Pablo had promised. But these weren't surveillance shots taken from distant rooftops or telephoto lenses. These were intimate, close-range images that could only have been captured by someone with complete access to his family's daily routines. Sophia brushing her teeth in their bathroom mirror, her face bright with innocence. Elena reading in their bed, wearing the nightgown he had bought her for their anniversary. His mother hanging laundry in the courtyard of her apartment building, her arthritic hands carefully pinning each piece to the line. But it was the final photograph that shattered something fundamental inside him. Elena stood in a hospital ward surrounded by children, her face radiant with the same compassion that had made him fall in love with her 15 years ago. She was holding the hand of a little girl who couldn't have been more than 6, both of them laughing at something beyond the camera's frame. In the background, barely visible but unmistakable, was a small placard that read Hospital Infantil Pablo Escobar, Pabellón de Caridad. His wife, his Elena, working in Pablo's hospital, caring for the same children who would die in 3 days because of intelligence Carlos had gathered, reports he had filed, surveillance he had conducted with meticulous professional pride. "She volunteers there every Thursday," Pablo said quietly. "The children call her Angel Elena. She brings them books, reads stories, stays late to comfort the ones who cry for their mothers. Last week she donated her own blood when they ran short during an emergency surgery." Carlos dropped the photographs, watching them scatter across Pablo's polished desk like fragments of his destroyed life. The room began to spin, or perhaps it was just his world tilting off its axis, as every assumption he had built his career upon crumbled into dust. "The raid," he whispered, "is scheduled for Thursday afternoon," Pablo confirmed. "Your handlers chose the timing based on your surveillance reports indicating minimum security presence. They don't know about Elena's volunteer schedule. They don't know about the 37 children currently receiving treatment. They don't know because you didn't know." The weight of Pablo's orchestration crashed down on Carlos with crushing force. 2 years of his life had been a performance in a play whose script he had never been allowed to read. Every piece of intelligence he had gathered, every report filed with such careful attention to detail, every risk taken in service of what he believed was justice, all of it had been guided by Pablo's invisible hand toward this moment of perfect, impossible choice. "You planned this from the beginning," Carlos said, his voice hollow. "I planned for justice," Pablo replied. "The rest was simply patience." Carlos thought of his morning routine, kissing Elena goodbye, promising Sofia he would be home for dinner, checking his weapon before heading out to gather intelligence that would protect innocent lives. The mundane rituals of a man who believed he understood the difference between right and wrong, between duty and betrayal, between justice and revenge. "There has to be another way," he said desperately. "I can warn the children without betraying your country, without destroying your career, without admitting to your wife that everything she knows about you is a lie." Pablo's voice carried no mockery, only the inexorable logic of consequences. "There is no path through this that leaves your old life intact, detective. That illusion ended the moment you walked into this room." Carlos stared at the scattered photographs, each image representing a piece of his soul that Pablo now owned. His daughter's trust, his wife's love, his mother's pride, the children Elena cared for with such devotion, all of it balanced against duty, honor, the oath he had sworn to protect his country from men exactly like Pablo Escobar. "Elena will be there Thursday," Carlos said, the words feeling like glass in his throat. "Unless you warn her," Pablo agreed. "Unless you find a reason for her to stay home, unless you choose to save her, along with the children your government is planning to murder." The envelope lay empty before him, its contents now scattered like the fragments of every choice he had thought was his to make. Outside Pablo's window, Medellin continued its daily rhythms, unaware that in this room a man's entire existence was being systematically dismantled by forces he had never truly understood. Carlos closed his eyes and realized that Detective Carlos Mendoza, husband, father, servant of justice, had just ceased to exist. What would emerge from this room would be something else entirely, something forged in the impossible space between salvation and damnation. The transformation was already beginning.